This is Intercepted. Welcome to Dropsite News. I'm Murtaza Hussain. Leading figures in the Trump administration have repeatedly vowed to pivot away from involvement in new wars in the Middle East. But a major crisis still looms on the horizon with Iran. In his first term, former President Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal, also known as the JCPOA, setting the stage for a renewed campaign of sanctions, sabotage, and assassination targeting Iran. Iran responded by vastly ramping up its nuclear enrichment program. The situation is now nearing what French President Emmanuel Macron has called a point of no return. As the nuclear program advances and Western countries weigh their dwindling options for how to respond. Even after Israel inflicted major blows on Iran's allies in the region over the past year, a U.S. war with Iran, a country roughly 3 times the size of Iraq, would be an extremely difficult and dangerous endeavor, and would destroy Trump's vow to wind down U.S. wars in the region. The U.S. now faces a choice of reengaging diplomatically with Iran, going to war, or accepting a nuclear Iran as a new reality in the Middle East. To discuss the situation and the history that brought us here, we are now joined by Sina Tusi. Sina is a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy and an expert on Iran.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be on.
So Sina, obviously today a new administration is coming into the power in the U.S. There are many very hawkish figures associated with the former Trump administration, which took a very hard line towards Iran during his last time in office. Can you talk a bit about how the Iranian establishment is responding to the situation or considering what moves they make in response to the return of an administration which last time proved to be so hostile to diplomacy or any form of relations with Iran?
Yeah, Iran's position vis-a-vis the second Trump administration is shaping up to be quite different than its approach the first time around. And really, the kind of geopolitical landscape is also significantly different than when Iran first had to deal with the Trump administration. So we saw in 2016, Trump was elected after a campaign where he promised to leave the Iran nuclear deal that the previous administration, Barack Obama, had just reached with Iran. That deal was actually starting its implementation in January 2016. All throughout that year, Trump called it a historically bad deal, that he was going to tear it up. And lo and behold, when he got into office, he started upping the rhetoric against Iran, and he started gradually pursuing escalation. And by May of 2018, he did leave the deal, and he pursued this maximum pressure policy against Iran. And at that time, you had this reformist government, presidential administration in Iran that had negotiated the deal with the Obama administration. People like the former moderate president Hassan Rouhani or the former foreign minister Javad Zarif. And they had really kind of hedged all their political capital on the deal. They were really politically greatly weakened by it. But at the time, Trump coming in, it really was a shock to, I think, the Iranian social and political landscape and also the economy. It was, coming in with those unprecedented sanctions. Like, I think, the extent of U.S. sanctions on Iran is sometimes kind of understated in a lot of political discussions. It's actually, in terms of its impact, it is more severe than the sanctions on Russia, for example. It's not the same. It's not as many sanctions designations, but given that the U.S. is threatening secondary sanctions against any country that deals with Iran, that is more severe than what Russia has been able to continue to do in terms of its oil trade with India and other countries. So Iran is really, Trump's first term really shocked the Iranian political system. It really caused a really sharp decline in the Iranian currency, inflation. It was like this shock therapy. And Iran, as a result of that, it did pursue this kind of counter-escalation strategy where marked by, trying to circumvent sanctions, developing alternative routes, selling oil at a discount on the black markets, mostly to China. In terms of increasing its own pressure on the U.S., we saw attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. During Trump's first term, we saw attacks on, various oil infrastructure, both within Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And we saw also after the U.S. assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general in 2020, that Iran actually attacked the U.S. military base with missiles in January 2020. So since then, now we're coming into the second term where we've had 4 years of Biden. Biden promised to rejoin the nuclear deal. He ultimately failed to do so. We can get into that and maybe some of the reasons why. But now Iran is it's in a very different landscape. So the main differences, I would argue, are one, Iran is in some ways more vulnerable now, in some ways less vulnerable. So its overall economy, a political economy, I would argue is more resilient to sanctions. I mean, it's been living under sanctions, severe sanctions since 2018 now. And it is still, there are still these kind of shocks to its economy. Like even since Trump's election, the toman has depreciated by like 20, 30%. But overall, it has this infrastructure in place of exporting its oil, circumventing the sanctions. I mean, yeah, circumventing a lot of the kind of traditional routes, mostly to China. We'll have to see if this holds up during Trump's era. I think there's a strong argument to be made that it will, for various reasons. I think, the hawks say it's a matter of Trump or Biden having lax enforcement. I think it's more so the Chinese willingness to buy this oil and Iran's ability to circumvent the sanctions. And then, in the regional landscape, we see that many of the proponents of maximum pressure are now, they've abandoned that strategy and they've actually pursued engagements with Iran and trying to have detente with Iran, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, a lot of their allies in the Arab world. This is a huge difference, I think, especially since a lot of the logic behind the detente from the Saudis and the Emiratis vis-a-vis Iran is that maximum pressure. They had these hopes that, America will go and put Iran in a box and keep it there and contain it or do a regime change, and they'll be able to reap the benefits of that. But contrary to these expectations, it really created a lot of costs for them, that these are economies that are vulnerable. They need long-term stability for all the foreign investment they're trying to attract. And, Iranian missiles or Houthi missiles striking Riyadh or Dubai are going to really shock their economy. So they pursued detente with Iran. And I think similarly with Trump, and we can get into this more, but he and his family and a lot of his inner circle have a lot of investments in the Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE. And perhaps that'll be part of their calculation too, for just as vulnerable as those economies will be to another round of major escalation with Iran, is that, their personal investments and personal wealth of Trump and his family could become vulnerable. They have, many billions of dollars at Kushner and Trump and them. So in short, I think that all of this, and we can get into this more, but there are reasons that I would argue that there are variables that are conducive to a new deal with Iran that are aligned. And we can get into unpacking those now. And there's also, certain variables that are not as conducive, with forces that are going to try to sabotage it. And Trump, we'll see what path he ultimately chooses, but he has an opportunity here, I would argue.
That leads into my next question, because last year, Iran's former foreign minister, Javad Zarif, wrote an op-ed where he argued for renewed diplomatic engagement within the U.S. and Iran. And obviously, Zarif was at the head of renegotiating the nuclear deal with the U.S. in 2015. Now, we've also seen Iranian diplomats reaching out to people in Trump's orbit, like Elon Musk. There was a report that some Iranian officials met with him to try to build alternate channels of dialogue. Whereas at the same time, with the first Trump administration, you saw a very, very strong neoconservative influence over his policymaking and personnel decisions. And that really did shape the maximum pressure program that we saw during his first term. I'm curious, you mentioned that there are some forces aligned in favor of diplomacy and potentially even negotiating a new deal. That first deal was very difficult to negotiate because obviously you had to overcome domestic opposition in the United States, especially from supporters of Israel who were very hawkish towards Iran. Then also on the Iranian side, there are many people who were skeptical of diplomacy for the very reason that they argued that the U.S. was not trustworthy to hold up its end of the deal. And that position did seem to be validated to some degree by the emergence of Trump and the reneging on the 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. How do you weigh the balance of forces in the sense that who has more of the upper hand, in your view, for diplomacy? And given the complexity of doing something like the nuclear deal, how possible is it, and what sort of form would it need to take, do you think, to be able to thread the needle and actually pull off a very complex and sensitive deal between these two countries with a history of distrust?
Yes, I think in terms of the balance of political forces in Iran, the trajectory in the past 7 years, really since 2018, when Trump left the deal, has kind of been up and down. And so we saw that the most immediate impact was that the moderates and the kind of reformist elements within Iran's Islamic Republic political system, which is not a monolithic system ultimately, and there are a divergent range of views, including on relations with America and diplomacy with the US and Europe. And so we saw that after Trump reneged on the deal, really the political capital of the moderates and reformists was decimated. And these hardline forces and more conservative forces in Iran that had warned against trusting the U.S., saying that the U.S. cannot be trusted, they were really empowered, and they started really consolidating power. The Revolutionary Guards really, like Rouhani, when he was elected in 2013 and reelected in 2017, he explicitly criticized the guards, said that they had too much interference in the economy, that they were kind of harming diplomatic efforts with like provocative missile tests, with like anti-Israeli slogans. I remember in one debate, Rouhani called them out on that. But after, this 2018 experience and Trump experience, we saw that both the centrists and the Rouhani government kind of went more to the right, as it were, like more kind of opposed to, more critical of America and American pressure, and emphasizing the need to kind of retaliate. And Rouhani, that wasn't his rhetoric during the Obama administration. And then we saw the hardliners were empowered. Ultimately, they really tried to overtly take over the main centers of power in Iran. And this culminated in the 2021 election, where a conservative, Ebrahim Raisi, was elected president after, most reformists and moderates were barred from actually running, which was also testament to how the hardliners felt empowered, that they can really kind of try to take the reins of control. And then we had about 3 years of kind of unipolar or power in Iran, as they like to call it in the Iranian kind of political vernacular, that there's one faction, like the most conservative faction in Iran, they kind of controlled the presidency, the judiciary branch, the parliament, obviously these other institutions like the Revolutionary Guards, a lot of the clerical establishment, that this all came under the structure of the kind of traditional conservative school of thought in Iran, of which that's also not monolithic, but overall Raisi kind of united them, and he pursued, and then he was then aligned with Biden, really, and under Biden, we had this issue of potentially trying to revive the nuclear deal, and that ultimately did not happen. I mean, Biden really, he ran on a campaign promise to return to the deal, but the Democrats at the time were also split. You had this camp of Democrats, I remember in 2020, who were saying that, no, maximum pressure actually gives us a lot of leverage, that we should actually try to get more from Iran than just going back into the original deal. Not unlike what a lot of the Republicans were actually saying with Trump after Trump left the deal. And then you had some within the administration who said it needs to be a straight return, compliance for compliance. Ultimately, we saw that Biden came in, January 2021. I would argue he fumbled the ball in those first several months. They sent the wrong signals to Iran and Khamenei. There was rhetoric about Iran returning first, then the U.S. returning. Ultimately, then we hit that Iranian presidential election in June 2021, 6 months after Biden's inauguration, that led to Raisi coming to power. Then you saw this 3-year period of negotiations that didn't get anywhere, sanctions being increased, Iran continuing to kind of counter-escalate in the region, with various levels. Sometimes there was more, sometimes there was less. We did have some diplomatic efforts that happened in the Biden administration, but then two big things ultimately happened that once again shifted the trajectory of Iranian politics and also shifted the regional dynamics. One was the women life protests, women life freedom movement in Iran that started in October 2022 or September 2022, after this young woman, Mahsa Amini, who was visiting Tehran with her family from Kurdistan province in Iran, and she was arrested by the morality police in Tehran, and she later died in custody. Many people thought she was killed. She was kind of subject to police brutality, and this ultimately set off months-long major protest movements in Iran, marked by especially young people taking to the streets across the country and universities. Major government crackdown. Hundreds of people we know have been documented as being killed. Thousands of arrests that fall. And so this really shook Iran's political landscape. The government reacted with this very harsh and brutal crackdown. And emerging from that, however, was deepening this crisis of legitimacy for Iran's Islamic Republic system. That, you had widespread public discontent, that even though the government managed to kind of put a lid on it by early 2023, this was kind of like flames beneath the ashes that were still, this discontent was there. And I think that contributed to kind of the pendulum shifting again in Iranian politics, where you fast forward to Ebrahim Raisi dying in a helicopter crash last April, I believe it was, and there were snap presidential elections, and to the surprise of many, that this one reformist member of parliament was allowed to run. He was actually someone who was critical of the government crackdown during the Mahsa Amini protests. He criticized the morality police on state TV at that time. And he was allowed to run. We had this short election cycle where he was going up against some of Iran's most prominent hardline voices and his rivals. But he ultimately won, to the surprise of many. It was a slim, the turnout was very low again. We saw that, it was a 2-round election. In the first round, about 40% of people, the electorate turned out. Second round was 50%. And Masoud Pezeshkian, who was this reformist parliamentarian, ultimately won out. So the pendulum in Iranian politics is kind of shifted back to this kind of pro-diplomacy camp. So Pezeshkian is someone who ran also, he criticized the morality police and this kind of enforcement of mandatory hijab in Iran. And he also really emphasized that Iran needs to pursue kind of diplomatic de-escalation in its foreign policy. It needs to, again, he started talking about the importance of going back in the JCPOA and improving ties. And he really represents the school of thought within the Islamic Republic that, not so subtly wants improved ties with the United States and Europe, and overall arguably wants more competitive foreign relations, that Iran is not just dependent on China and Russia and a few neighboring countries and can't really develop meaningfully and is just kind of surviving in this kind of austerity-ridden way. So we have Pezeshkian there now, and even beyond Pezeshkian, I would argue that there are many signs that other centers of power in Iran are now behind him and kind of giving diplomacy another serious chance, including Khamenei. Certain speeches he's made in recent months, people from his office or his advisors, for example, Ali Larijani, who's kind of a pragmatic, conservative political figure in Iran. He recently said, and he's an advisor right now to Khamenei, the supreme leader. And he recently said in an interview that that Iran wants to go back, wants a nuclear deal, that this is their preference right now. So that this is part of the landscape right now. We can get into how desperate is Iran for the deal, how much it could withstand another round of maximum pressure. If a deal falls through, how would that potentially affect the political trajectory in Iran? But then on the U.S. side, interestingly, we've seen that Trump has said, he said throughout the campaign, even after he lost in 2021, that he was he wants a deal with Iran. He was on the cusp of a deal with Iran. He said during this campaign that, all Iran needs to do is not build a nuclear weapon and it could have a deal. And Iran also, their stated goal is to not have a nuclear weapon. They say they don't want one. They have this massive kind of nuclear program and enrichment cycle, but they've gone short of actually weaponizing that program. So it seems like, there is a window for that deal, but for Trump, he is kind of, in the Trump world, there's these divisions between, this more kind of non-interventionist wing of the Republican Party and now certain figures in his administration, it seems like, if they'll get approved by Congress, and then the more traditional, very hawkish Republican foreign policy establishment and kind of neoconservatives. So you have people like Marco Rubio, his kind of Secretary of State nominee, or Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, versus, people who are kind of considered more non-interventionist, like Tulsi Gabbard for national security, for defense intelligence chief. Even J.D. Vance, his VP pick, is kind of, been more anti-war in his rhetoric. So for Trump, he's going to have to balance, how much pressure he wants to pursue, how serious he is about a deal. And even if he wants a deal, we saw last time his hawkish advisors like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo actually sabotaged his efforts and were hindering those efforts. So Trump really needs to, even if he's trying to play this good cop, bad cop strategy, and he ultimately wants a deal with Iran or international politics in general, I would argue that is a fraught policy. And from the beginning, he needs to be, even if he's going to start increasing some pressure from the beginning, he needs to seriously communicate a desire for a deal and not miss trying this opportunity in a serious way. Because I would argue it's a real opportunity, and he could ultimately build a great political legacy for himself in this regard, in terms of Iran and the Middle East, if he strikes a deal with Iran. This problem that U.S. presidents for decades have not been able to fix, and a deal with Trump arguably is more kind of sustainable than a deal with Biden, because the Republicans being the more hawkish party in U.S. politics, Trump being who he is and his power over the Republican Party, them owning both branches, both houses of Congress, it could be more sustainable if he reaches a deal and supports it.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned J.D. Vance too, because he did an interview a few months back where he mentioned that in the context of U.S.-Israel relations, that there were certain aspects of policy or interest where the U.S. and Israel may diverge. And one thing he mentioned specifically is that the U.S. does not want to go to war with Iran. And that is in line, I think, with what you identified as at least some more anti-interventionist instincts among prominent people in his administration. And I do get the sense, to your point, that many people in his administration are traditionally hawkish, but a lot of the staffing seems to represent or seems to reflect a desire to focus on China. And the U.S. and under Trump in the first term was quite hawkish on China. There's pretty consistent rhetoric in many segments of D.C. and the military establishment that the U.S. is going to pivot to Asia. They've been saying this for many years, but it seems like his staffing seems to suggest that's a possibility. And, Iran, whereas the U.S. may have a very bad relationship with Iran and an unhappy relationship in the Middle East generally, there seems to be a desire to pivot away from the region and not devote so much resources and energy to more wars or even more diplomatic and spending capital in the region where they had very little successes over the past 2 decades. One thing I was curious in your perspective, Sina, you mentioned that the goal of the Iranian establishment is actually not to have a nuclear weapon. And there's also been a fatwa, I think that was reported, or a religious edict by the supreme leader of Iran some time ago, where he deemed that the nuclear weapons are not in line with Iran's ethical and moral principles. There's been a lot of discussion about this in the past, and yet there's a level of ambiguity, I think, of what is possible in terms of an escalating situation of conflict. One thing that I'm curious about is that, and I want to talk about this a bit more later, but Iran had built this network of deterrent organizations around the Middle East, and it was called the Axis of Resistance, or it's still called the Axis of Resistance. And this included, obviously, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was the most prominent party in this axis. The Syrian government was part of it, and then the militias in Iraq, and then also the Houthis in Yemen. And this alliance has been significantly degraded in recent months. In the war with the war in Gaza, Hamas also was part of the party to this. Hamas has been greatly weakened. Hezbollah obviously has been damaged as well too, and the change of government in Syria. So Iran's deterrence seems to have weakened, and it seems to have become have less leverage than it did in the past. Would that change the Iranian leadership's calculus in terms of thinking, well, maybe if we've lost these deterrent capabilities, we may need to replace it with a nuclear deterrent? And of course, that would not be their first preference. It seems like there's very strong consensus in favor of renewed diplomacy. But if that proves to be impossible, or if the U.S. administration somehow proves to be very, very determined on having regime change in Iran, regardless, could Iran nuclearize? And if they did, what would be the constraints or the risk factors that the Iranian establishment may consider before choosing to make such a decision if they were to do so?
Yes, so the rhetoric actually within Iran over the past year and even a little bit earlier than that as well has really shifted to more publicly speaking about this possibility of weaponizing this nuclear program, which had never really happened before from high level officials. They'd always kind of maintained that this is a peaceful nuclear program, even though they were always kind of hedging, but rhetorically and publicly, they never really even discussed the possibility. Khamenei had this fatwa dating back many years ago. Um, and we've seen that in this context of heightened regional tensions, and especially, in the past several months where Iran's kind of a lot of its regional strategic depth and this resistance axis that you mentioned has been weakened, that this rhetoric continues to be floated within Iran, that Iran may need nuclear weapons as a deterrent. And, whereas, if its regional allies are weakened and if Israel and them feel like they can attack Iran with minimal cost, that Iran would need a nuclear weapon as a deterrent. And we've seen this from pretty senior officials who've kind of been much more kind of liberal in how they talk about this possibility. Like we saw Ali Akbar Saleh, he put it in an interesting way. Where he's the former head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, and he was actually one of the chief nuclear negotiators back with Obama, and a foreign minister. And he gave an interview like last year where he said that, a nuclear bomb, it's like, imagine if you have a car, you need like, the wheel, the steering wheel, the hood, all these various components of a car, and then you put it together and you have a car. He's like, we have all these components, but we haven't put it together. So basically saying like Iran has this capability to, weaponize if and when it chooses to, but it hasn't made that decision yet. That's basically, and this is obviously a point of leverage for the Iranians as well. The more they expand their nuclear program, it both gives them more leverage to get a deal if they want a deal, or just go for the bomb very quickly and have it quickly. So right now, the latest estimates from various kind of non-proliferation institutions and experts is that Iran's breakout time, which is the amount of time it needs to amass enough like enriched uranium for just one nuclear weapon, that is estimated to be a week now. It used to be like 6 months under the nuclear, or a year actually, under the nuclear deal, which really degraded Iran's nuclear capabilities. Now Iran has much higher stockpiles of enriched uranium. It's enriching at higher levels. It has much more advanced centrifuges that actually do the uranium enrichments. And so it can really just get to weapons grade uranium in a very short amount of time and have enough uranium for like, I think it's more for a couple bombs in like a week. Then they would actually have to build a warhead and put it on a missile. There's varying estimates of how long that would take. Some people say like a rudimentary warhead might actually not be that long. I've heard some arguments where just another couple weeks to build some rudimentary warhead, and it wouldn't be put on a missile, but it could be something like, I don't know, like on a ship or something. But for like an ICBM, that would potentially add another year to the timeline for Iran to build a sophisticated enough warhead to put it on a missile. It does have pretty sophisticated missiles, including stuff that is kind of going towards being intercontinental ballistic missiles. But, that would also, though, add more time. But so for now, it actually seems like the side in Tehran that has been advocating against weaponization is actually more ascendant just in the past 2 months. I've seen that, even Khamenei in his rhetoric has kind of really emphasized again, no, the program is peaceful. It's always been peaceful. Various people around the Serbian leader have also been kind of emphasizing that. I think, again, signaling that they want a deal, that they're serious about trying to pursue a deal. I would argue, my reading is that they are serious and giving this another go with the U.S. But then, in terms of the regional kind of influence of Iran, to your other question about the resistance axis, I think there's a number of things at play here. So when it comes to Iran's national security strategy, its threat perceptions have really been based on, U.S. and or Israeli attack. So it formed these alliances with these regional peoples who are also kind of isolated from the U.S. regional order. So we're talking about, occupied Palestinians, Shia in Lebanon, back in the 80s when they were under Israeli occupation, Shia in Iraq, and other groups, certain Christian parties or Kurdish parties in Iraq and even in Syria at times, or the Houthis, the Zaidi Muslims in Yemen. That these are also constituencies in the region that, they're not just, this idea that they're like these alien creations of Iran. I would push back against that. I think these are constituencies that are also alienated from this U.S.-led regional order for decades, marked by supporting these Arab dictators or Israeli occupation. So you've had these constituencies that have been outside of that. They're looking for a partner. Iran's looking for a partner. They developed these partnerships. We got, Hezbollah came out of the Israeli occupation. Iran supported these kind of various Palestinian groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad. And then even during the beginning, in the early 80s, they supported like the PLO until they had a falling out involving Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And then, the Houthis, obviously. So this all leads me to say that to this point of, Gaza is devastated. Lebanon, you had this 2-month really intense, like after October 7th, Hezbollah started shooting missiles and drones and rockets into northern Israel. I've estimates of between 1 to 200,000 Israelis were displaced, which really went to the heart of Zionism as a political project. And within the 48 borders, Israel couldn't keep its citizens safe. All these towns were emptied. And we had, up until earlier, last fall, where, this was the status quo on the front, and the northern front, Israel's northern front with Hezbollah. And then we had this massive escalation with Lebanon after, we had the walkie-talkie and pager explosions. We had, Nasrallah's assassination, wiping out the senior kind of commanders of Hezbollah's military forces. But interestingly, what we did have, and I think that is also kind of not acknowledged as much in kind of a lot of the one-sided media portrayals in the U.S. and the U.S. kind of mainstream press, is that in this 2-month period where Israel launched a ground invasion, it did a massive kind of bombardment of Lebanon, that Hezbollah was keeping up its missile and drone attacks across northern Israel, actually increasing their intensity, increasing their depth into Israel. Just a few days before the ceasefire was reached, they were actually hitting Tel Aviv, and these attacks had taken casualties, and even more significantly, probably, they just created this general sense of insecurity for Israelis, for their economy, for much like the Houthi attack continued to do in Tel Aviv. And, that has political and economic ramifications for Israel. So ultimately, the ceasefire that Hezbollah agreed to, it was in a much weakened state. Hezbollah had linked a Gaza ceasefire to its attacks on Israel. It didn't achieve that. And now a lot of the political developments in Lebanon are reflecting weakened Hezbollah influence. But so all of this is to say that when we're kind of talking about an attack on Iran, much bigger adversary for the Israelis and Americans, much bigger country, much more formidable kind of military infrastructure, missiles, missiles that they proved in the past year, and with their 2 missile attacks on Israel, that regardless of these debates about their accuracy, they managed to make impact. Israel has this multi-layered, very sophisticated air defense system, which is incredibly expensive, and they hit targets. They hit military bases, and these were, this wasn't the full force of Iran's missile attacks. So we're talking about they weren't that accurate. The mere fact that they can make impact in these big kind of missile launch attacks, that, in the event of an all-out war, in a hypothetical scenario where the U.S. and Israel launching some massive attack on Iran has the capability, the other arm of its deterrence is just its own military capabilities. It's its missiles and drones and, its various kind of conventional and asymmetric warfare capabilities that it could create a real cost for Israel and the U.S., including for Israeli infrastructure, U.S. military bases in the region, U.S. allies, energy routes out of the Persian Gulf. Like I even mentioned earlier, Trump's own investments in these countries would be jeopardized if there's some big war in the Persian Gulf. And then on the other hand, you have that, Hezbollah and, Hamas, I would argue, are down but not out. That these are ultimately, like, to my point about these being constituencies that are marginalized, that are historically oppressed, that don't have a political horizon. By some estimates, I mean, Lebanon hasn't had a census for, I think, 15, 20 years, or I don't know, a long time. And Shias, some people say that the Shia Lebanese are the majority, but that's not really reflected in the current political structure. And some of the, the Shia, the Hezbollah line politicians in the parliament and the other main Shia group, Amal, they kind of, they voted ultimately for Joseph Aoun, who became president last week, but they didn't vote for the prime minister today. But, these constituencies, the more they feel marginalized, that this is actually, presents Iran an opportunity to continue to support them, to continue to have actually strong relations. And by their nature of being guerrilla groups, actually, if you study the history of guerrilla warfare, whether in Vietnam or the Taliban or many other examples, that as long as these groups, these constituencies, these populations, we're not talking about just this group, Hezbollah, Hamas, and we attach a label, this is a terrorist group or whatnot, that these constituencies, as long as they continue to feel marginalized and not given a political horizon, which Israel's not offering that at all to the Palestinians or the Lebanese really, and now with Syria, that I think that that's going to perpetuate the cycle of, continued violence there, that these groups will rearm, that they still have capabilities like Hezbollah's capabilities were not completely annihilated. It was still continuing to fire many missiles. It still has, it chose to not, I think their decision was ultimately not to go down the path of Gaza. They probably felt like they could continue to fight and really increase the cost for Israel, but at the cost of all of Lebanon being devastated like Gaza, which they ultimately decided not to do. But, Israel is not, this kind of, its dominance is not as unchallenged as I think the perception is increasingly in some quarters here in Washington. And I think actually the people who push that narrative, which is a lot of Israeli-aligned hawkish groups and analysts, is actually more geared towards American politics and Trump, to kind of portray Iran as much weaker and vulnerable as it is, to then argue, create political pressure on Trump to not pursue diplomacy and go in for the kill, go in for a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, continue maximum pressure, just don't negotiate with them. They're weak. You just continue sanctions or militarily attack them, and this regime will be gone, which I think is very dangerous thinking. It's very risky. It kind of portends much greater escalation. And especially when we have this alternative of a possible diplomatic solution, potentially here within grasp. So again, we see all these various forces at play right now. A lot of the hawks in Washington, people who are aligned with Israel lobby groups and right-wing hawkish Israeli groups that are giving this narrative of Trump, don't negotiate, Iran is weak, and then, Trump himself, it seems like, is actually aware of some of this, because he actually interestingly retweeted on Truth Social, I guess he reposted Tucker Carlson's interview with Jeffrey Sachs, where Jeffrey Sachs was talking about, Netanyahu's been trying to drag the U.S. into war with Iran for decades. And so it seems like Trump has some level of awareness that, that these groups and these hawks, they don't actually have his best interests in mind. They have their own interests in mind. Like Netanyahu and Israel's interests are obviously different from America's interests or Trump's political interests. And in terms of Trump's political interests, I think another big difference with his first term is now he is obviously a second-term president. He's freed from the constraint to re-election and, donor pressure. And he's really thinking more about this legacy. And Trump has always wanted to be seen as a deal maker. He says he wants peace. I mean, I obviously don't take him at his word. And his track record on that, including on Iran, is not good. But if he's serious about wanting to pursue, really make history, if he makes a big deal with Iran, there is reason to think that that is a possibility, in this next year, actually, I would argue.
Yeah, absolutely. And a very important point that I should raise for listeners as well is that if you look at the analysis of what it would take for a military strike to meaningfully degrade the Iranian nuclear program or destroy the Iranian nuclear program, it will by no means be accomplished in 48 hours or a few days or something like that. It would probably require very extensive and ongoing U.S. military operations, Israeli military operations inside Iran, such that it really would be a war. It wouldn't just be a one-off situation that Trump could, or people around Trump could tell him, could be solved by pressing a few buttons. Because of the diffuse nature and the ability to conceal, and also the very grave inability to roll back knowledge once it's been developed of how to nuclearize or weaponize a nuclear program inside a country, it by no means could be accomplished by a few tactical airstrikes, such we saw in the past, Israeli strikes in Iraq or Syria to target certain nuclear facilities. And Iran, of course, is a much bigger country than even Iraq was, so whose involvement therein was so draining on the U.S. for well over a decade. Iran is about 3 times the size of Iraq, far bigger in terms of territory. So there's a lot more to deal with territory-wise and in terms of just personnel and the armed forces and Iranian society. So it's really asking the U.S. to embark on another major war to say we should solve this problem, quote unquote, with military strikes. And to your point, there have been statements and interesting sort of communications from Trump and people in his orbit reflecting their skepticism or lack of desire to go down that path given America's other pressing national security and political needs around the world. One thing I did want to ask you, and I just want to put this in a historical perspective a little bit. We've talked about this network of allied groups of Iran in the region, and they're in Palestine, they're in Yemen, they're in Lebanon, other places where, as you mentioned, there are groups of people who felt that they were left out of the current regional political structures and economic structures and so forth, with which Iran has built very strong ties. I just wanted to get your perspective on the evolution of this sort of network in historical context, because obviously in 1979 there was a revolution inside Iran which completely changed the character of the Iranian government. But just after that, there was a very, very brutal and traumatic invasion of Iran by Iraq. And at the time, later on, it was discovered that obviously the U.S. Had supported Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq in providing intelligence and weapons and chemical weapons as well too, which were used against Iranians. But also, many other countries in the region helped support this war with economic support and other backing, without which it probably could not have continued on for 8 years. And upwards of 1 million people were killed in this conflict. And many people who are part of the ruling establishment in Iran are actually veterans of that war. They were relatively young people who fought in the war at the time, and it became sort of a very formative national experience for those people, such that it probably shapes their views of the region and Iran's sense of threat and so forth from other countries in the present day. So this emergence of this network, it seems also, a means for Iran to deter Israel or deter the United States from attacking the Iranian homeland. But also it seems like it was a strategic depth to avoid a repeat of an Iran-Iraq war situation happening in the future. And today it seems like that, the level of strategic depth for Iran has now reduced simply just to mainly to Iraq, I would say, and its influence in that country. Can you talk a bit about why that historical experience, how it explains current Iranian decision making, and it's often criticized and sometimes justly so as very aggressive against other countries and very alienating, but it seems to be part of a broader story that's been taking place for a few decades beyond just what's happening in the news at the moment.
Yes, I think, Iran's, there's this historical experience that has shaped the political evolution of Iran in the past, since the revolution that informed that, even before the Iran-Iraq war, a lot of the political kind of trajectories that led to the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was kind of Iran's experience with colonialism and kind of American domination and Western domination, as well as, before that, British and Russian domination. That much like, most parts of Asia and Africa and Latin America, that this kind of 1 or 2 centuries of European kind of global domination and colonialism, that you had this reaction within a lot of these societies that, in China, for example, they call it the dysentery of humiliation, right? Or, in Iran, it was a similar thing in the rhetoric of, people across the political spectrum, not just what became, Khomeini, who was the leader of the Iranian Revolution, who kind of ushered in this kind of Islamicism as a force that we understand it kind of within at least Iranian foreign policy. That a lot of their motivation was actually this kind of perception of Iranian kind of falling subservient to kind of Western or colonial aims, and in Iran, they pointed to the 1953 coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, the kind of nationalist prime minister at the time. And I would argue that, nowadays in Iranian society, there is more nuanced kind of views about its overall modern history in terms of the lessons that could be derived, and which actually informs, I think, some of the debates with respect to the US right now. So, like you said, a lot of the kind of Iranian leadership comes from that Iran-Iraq war generation, actually, right now. That these are people who, they were young, men in the 1980s. They were on the front lines of the Iran-Iraq war against Saddam Hussein. And they, their perception was that, it was most of the, global great powers and regional countries that were allied, supporting Saddam Hussein to kind of capture Iranian territory and kind of nip their revolution in their bud in their worldview, and so, that war was marked by a lot of brutality and kind of bombardments of Iranian cities and chemical weapons attacks. And so that, that's kind of lost in the debates now, but that shaped this threat perception. I think, even someone like Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei, he is of that era of kind of global South, third worldism, kind of anti-colonialism. Even Khomeini was kind of, I think, more at that, much more that than this kind of Shia clerical establishment aligned figure. He was actually very much against the traditional Shia clerical establishment. But regardless, they took Iran on a path of very sharp anti-Americanism that many Iranians see now as having come at too great of a cost for their country, that they elected on a national security strategy, which ultimately the bottom line for the Iranian people has been that, for example, during the Shah's time, when Iran was kind of part of the twin pillar U.S. strategy towards the region, where it relied on Saudi Arabia and Iran to kind of secure the Persian Gulf in the 70s and against Soviet Union, that Iranian people enjoyed, back then, especially when it comes to the grievances of the Iranian youth today, basically that back then Iran had good relations with, the West and the world, that they had kind of social freedoms that existed then, but, political freedoms were obviously much, very restricted as well. But now, after, Iran has taken this position in the past 40 years of kind of trying to carve out its own sphere of influence in the Middle East, in this broader historical context of, colonial humiliation, whatever you want to call it, in the past 2 centuries, try to kind of provide for its own security, increase its strategic depth, and these are all also lessons from the Iran-Iraq war, develop its own indigenous military capabilities, where during the Iran-Iraq war, they couldn't, get a lot of weapons from abroad. So they, have developed their own missile program, their own kind of military industrial base. They're now exporting a lot of weapons and drones, especially. But, when it comes to this regional strategic depth angle of it, yeah, this has been greatly, it's been diminished. I mean, Hezbollah is weakened. It's not out. We'll have to see how they maneuver in the coming months and years. Obviously, the Palestinian issue isn't going anywhere, and probably Israel has created much more of a security challenge in the long term, medium term for itself. But for the moment, Iran has been pushed back in terms of its kind of the influence it had and the power that its kind of allies right up on Israel's border had. It's been kind of, like you said, pushed back to Iraq, or, the popular mobilization forces and a lot of these Shia militias are there. They're strong, they're armed, but they're also under a lot of pressure, including from an Iraqi government that doesn't want to get in a big fight and that has a lot to lose. And then the Houthis also, obviously, they're another part of this story, and they also have significant capabilities and somewhat independent, more independent of Iran, but also, so the strategic depth is I would argue, is diminished but not gone. But the military capabilities are strong, and I think it's testament to the fact that they are strong, that the Israelis have, in their own report, in the Israeli press is actually much more honest than the American press. I would argue that they had this committee recently. I think it was called the Dreck Committee. They had this committee that kind of shapes national security strategy in Israel, and they gave their recommendations to Netanyahu's government. Like, this was about last week. This was in early January, and they said that Israel does not have the ability to independently attack Iran's nuclear program and take it out, that they need U.S. support. So if this idea of Israeli invincibility, that they took out Iran's air defenses, that Iran is kind of extremely vulnerable right now, that the Israelis themselves acknowledge that no, like this is going to be costly, they can't do it. They're going to need, massive U.S. support, and I think you very accurately outlined what that would entail. Like, if they couldn't take out Israelis, Hezbollah's ability to fire missiles deep into Israel, 2 months into destroying large parts of, Lebanon, a much smaller country where they had immense intelligence penetration, where they have allies. Iran is a country of 90 million people, much bigger, much more spread out, buried nuclear weapons, military capabilities, and thousands of missiles. And they actually did a military maneuver this week. They're doing these military exercises ahead of Trump's inauguration. I think to signal that they have all these capabilities, that they're not as weak as some portray. So war would be very costly. And within this context, though, I think where the school of thought in Iran that is emerging more dominant out of these historical experiences of the Iran-Iraq War, the Shah era, Iran's modern history, is this idea now that is gaining more prominence that Iran needs to have kind of balanced foreign relations, that Iran, this idea of Iran kind of leading the charge against the US or Israel in the region and kind of, spending all this cost at kind of creating some kind of post-American order in the Middle East, and Iran bearing the brunt of that, or creating this new order, that has, I think, been immensely costly for the country. And not to say that school of thought is eliminated from Iran, but it's far from that. Like, they're still very powerful, the people who aspire for that. But you have this school of thought that says Iran needs like kind of good productive relations with the West, like with America and Europe, good productive relations with Russia, and good productive relations with China, and can kind of play them all and reap the economic benefits. And it should focus on economic development and not just this kind of military security influence and power projection in the region. That's ultimately what its people need, that its economy needs, that what it needs to be to meet its kind of development goals. And so that school of thought is really embodied in Pezeshkian and Javad Zarif, this kind of more moderate reformist school of thought. And I think, they're actually, Pezeshkian is going to Moscow this week to sign this major Russian-Iran strategic cooperation agreement. They're framing it as that it seems like it's going to deepen their military and economic cooperation over the long term. They have one of those with China, but they ultimately need U.S. sanctions to be lifted to really reap the benefits of even trade with Russia and China. I mean, especially China and Chinese companies who don't want to be subject to U.S. secondary sanctions. And then with other neighboring countries, global powers, obviously. So there is this kind of grand strategic logic for many in Iran to kind of, for this new pivot in their foreign policy, which it wouldn't be this kind of one-sided, like Iran is going to totally capitulate to U.S. demands. And if that's what Trump is seeking, I don't think that's going to get anywhere, and they will double down. But if there is room, if there is a compromise that is kind of fair to Iran and its military capabilities, that they're not going to go after Iran's missiles or, try to go after more domestic things within Iran, that they want to deal on the nuclear front, perhaps some regional stuff will be a part of that, but then Iran will kind of be in a position where it can kind of reap economic benefits with the U.S. U.S. can, I think the Iranians are actually open to American investments in their economy, including, the supreme leader. But so there's an opportunity that exists for, I think, big strategic shift. And America, like you said, would want to pivot more to China. The idea of another big war in the Middle East would be very disastrous, arguably for American strategic interests in the 21st century. So again, there are these kind of ingredients there that create the possibility for a deal, but it could very well go sideways. And I'm not saying I'm necessarily optimistic. It could very well go sideways, and I think Iran could double down, and there's forces there that will want to double down. It can become like North Korea or something. But it's the coming months will be very critical.
See, I just want to ask you one last question, just to be cognizant of time as well too. But your comments are so insightful. I just wanted to get your perspective on one more thing. Obviously, in Iran, there's tremendous political ferment. It has been for many years now, and you just outlined the fact very well that the Iranian political system is not a monolith, even with all the constraints and controls that are put onto it, there's quite a bit of ideological diversity inside the Iranian system as it exists. In Iran, obviously, there's a very unique office of the supreme leader, and Ayatollah Khamenei is currently the supreme leader. And that office holds a lot of political power and influence over the trajectory of Iran's domestic and foreign policy. Khamenei is pretty old now. I think he's in his 80s now, or mid to late 80s. He's had health problems, and of course, at some point, he's going to pass away. How do you see this potential turnover in that office potentially resulting in a shift in the sort of the political dynamics that you outlined that are taking place or evolving inside Iran? And more pointedly, when Khamenei passes away, do we know what kind of office holder may replace him, and what may that portend for how Iran transforms both domestically and its relations with the U.S. and other countries in the region?
Yeah, I think Khamenei's eventual passing will be a real inflection point. I mean, Iran's domestic politics are very rivalrous, contrary to a lot of the kind of simplistic portrayals in the mainstream press, that there are very different kind of visions for the future of Iran, the Islamic Republic, within the kind of ruling establishment. And people, I think, ready to go after each other's throats, really. I mean, some of the rivalries are really intense. But, Pezeshkian has interestingly been really pursuing, this new reformist president, this idea of national consensus, and different than past moderate or reformist presidents, where he's trying to really work with the conservatives. He's trying to build consensus on a lot of these issues like diplomacy with the U.S., kind of pushing down, decreasing enforcement of mandatory hijab, kind of lifting certain internet restrictions and various other things in his agenda. And I think this also is buy-in from the supreme leader, and I think potentially with an eye to this looming succession where, having all these factions developing kind of a more consensus-driven approach for what comes next. And, Khamenei's succession, how that materializes, it could be potentially a destabilizing thing. It could be where the Islamic Republic's institutions kind of maintain themselves and produce either another leader or some kind of other continuation of this office. Within Iran, there have been ideas publicly spoken about by senior people, potentially going to a council of leadership, potentially having kind of, I don't know, whether it be a more pragmatic or moderate, successor ultimately in one figure. But this is ultimately something that, Khamenei was a very unique figure in terms of, his political authority. He was one of the 1979 revolutionary leaders. There's really no one else with that political weight in Iran. So I think whatever it's going to be a diminished office. And Iran has these councils, Supreme National Security Council and whatnot, that really do try to govern, they do represent consensus as it exists within the Islamic Republic system, which is a confined system, obviously. There's many Iranians, if not most Iranians, outside of the politics of the Islamic Republic, and they want more fundamental change. But even within, the system, there's big differences. And, so I think that'll be a key litmus test. Is it going to be a moment of instability? They're trying to position themselves, it seems like, to ensure some kind of smooth transition with minimal conflict. Back in, this only happened once before, after Khomeini, the original revolutionary leader, died in 1989, and Khomeini became supreme leader, and that was a pretty smooth process. This is going to be a major inflection point for Iran. It could get potentially kind of destabilizing, but we'll have to see. I mean, there's so many other factors at play, and U.S. pressure can play a role in terms of kind of uniting the system among itself. If it's like, we're either going to all hang separately or hang together, but we're going to get hung. So that is a very possibility. So a lot of factors at play, but he's an old man, like you said, in his late 80s, so it'll probably happen sooner rather than later.
Sina, thanks so much for your comments. Could have kept you for longer, but I'll leave it at that. Thanks for joining us today on the show. Thanks
for having me.
Sina is a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy and an expert on Iran. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our new podcast feed by searching for Dropsite News wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please do leave us a rating or review, as it helps other listeners to find us as well. Our show today was produced by Jose Oliveras. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to dropsitenews.com. If you have the funds to do so, please do become a paid subscriber. All our content is free for anyone, but our paid subscribers are the fuel that keeps our engine running. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms, and please do share our work. This program was made possible in part by a grant from The Intercept. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Murtaza Hussain.